Shalom and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. And we bring you into our world here, as it were, in Mevaseret Zion, in our studios for Israel Vision magazine. And today our program is with a very special guest, Max Eisen from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And he is a Holocaust survivor who has dedicated these years of his life in his retirement to educating students and college professors and defense ministry experts on the horrors of the Holocaust. You won't want to miss this interview. This is a very special man who is making a difference. Shalom and welcome back. And today our guest, as I mentioned, is Max Eisen from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And he's a delightful person. You're going to enjoy meeting him, but his story is extremely moving and touching. Thank you so much for being with us, Max.
Thank you.
We appreciate you very much.
Thank you.
And we have a few minutes, and it seems like what you went through is such an incredible story. We need 10 hours to tell this. But Max, bring us into your world a little bit. Today, you are dedicating your time and energy to teaching young people about the horrors of the Holocaust.
I started to speak in 1991 in Toronto. I became a speaker for the Holocaust Center in Toronto, and I was determined that I should not be a bystander. There are certain things that happened in Toronto. There was a person, Ernest Zundel, who denied that the Holocaust happened, and I realized that I need to be counted, and I started to speak in 1991.
Well, thank you very much for doing that. I know, and we're going to get into that in a minute, about your trips to Poland with the March of the Living with young people and your many, many trips to Israel. But before we do, bring us back in time, back to the 1940s when you were a child growing up in Europe. Tell us what happened.
I was born in Czechoslovakia, which was a democracy, where Jews had 20 golden years from 1919 till 1939. And I lived in a town of about 4,000 people, and we Jews were approximately 10% of the town's population, about 90 families, and I have a Orthodox background, and my family, my extended family, we all lived together in a large house. So my parents, my two younger brothers and my little sister, and my grandparents.
You actually have a picture of them here.
Yes. This was after Czechoslovakia was cut up into parts, into three parts, after the partition of Czechoslovakia under the Hungarian fascist government.
Now, where are you in this picture?
I'm over here in the middle.
Okay.
And as you can see, nobody has a smile on their face because this picture was taken for a reason that the police wanted to know not only where Jewish families lived, but what they looked like.
Yes.
And it says here that this is to confirm that this is the family of Eisen Zoltan in 1940. So this was the requirement in a fascist country.
Now, what actually bring us the persecution of Jews began in the middle of this regime. Were they cooperating with the Nazis then?
Well, actually, the persecution originated from Nazi Germany when Hitler came to power in 1933. And they had two pillars that they started the propaganda machinery against the Jews. Jews were dehumanized, demonized, and totally removed from everyday life. They were stripped from the entire worldly possession. And these laws were that they were fired from jobs, and in 1935, German Jews, their citizenship was taken away from them. So this template originated from Nazi Germany. And the other pillar of Nazi Germany's ideology, this was a Nazi ideology against the minority group of Jews, who in Germany, they numbered about 500,000 among 70 million. And they say the German Jews were more German than Germans themselves. They fought in the First World War with the highest distinction. So this was a society that...
They were bankers, they were intelligentsia, they were scientists, they were musicians,
Exactly.
They were the cultured people of the country.
And they were fighters in the Navy and the armies. just as my grandfather, who was an officer in the cavalry of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he fought on the Russian front for 2 years. So, but when Hitler came to power, their idea, he wrote in his book Mein Kampf that he is going to eradicate all Jews from Europe, and it was a government that had a ministry of propaganda, a ministry of genealogy, that they were going to track down who had a grandfather or a great-grandfather, and they were then labeled as Mischlings or mixtures, a half a Mischling or a quarter. And the second pillar of the Nazi ideology was how they're going to go about killing 11 million Jews in Europe, was the document that was called the Final Solution to the Jewish Problem in Europe. And this was at a conference in 1942 in Wannsee, when Reinhard Heydrich, who was the originator of this terrible scheme, invited 10 heads of ministries with Eichmann to decide how they're going to go about eradicating, as they said, 11 million Jews from England to Vladivostok.
So you were caught in this. You were a child, about, how old were you now when this vice hit you?
Well, in 1938, living in Czechoslovakia, we knew that there was this powerhouse coming at us from the West, Nazi Germany. And my father, in 1938, who had a radio, it was called a crystal radio, he was listening to a speech that Hitler made in Berlin. And all my father's friends came to our house. And I could see that all these old men were kind of, I thought they were old, they were in their 30s. I was 9 years old.
Right.
And we knew that something was going to happen, but we didn't know what. But the Nazis had this template that they were going to take with them as when the war broke out. In each and every country, they were going to constitute these racial laws. So,
get rid of the Jews.
Yes.
And you get rid of the messengers. You get rid of the message of God.
I suppose. So, it came to us when we became Hungarians in 1939, March the 15th. Hungary being an ally of Nazi Germany and a fascist country. These laws came into being in Hungary, where Jews were removed from jobs. They couldn't go to university. And my father's business was confiscated. Jews were not allowed to sell alcohol products and tobacco. And young Jewish men, males, were taken away to labor battalions from 18 to 50. So each and every town and village and city where all these young men were gone to work in these labor battalions, and but they were not getting paid for this.
But as a child, what happened to you that's very touching?
Well, when the law came out one day that all Jews have to wear a yellow star. So my mother had to find a piece of yellow cloth, cut it out in a shape of a star, and stitch it on my jacket.
Right.
And I had to march off to school that morning.
Here's an example of the yellow star right here. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but at least our viewers can see this star on the... These are actually Polish women, are they? Or are they Hungarian?
I think these are Hungarian women arriving in Birkenau on the platform, and you can see the crematory and gas chamber right in the background, and they had no idea that they were walking in front of this building where that is going to cause their death just within minutes.
But there's the stars. Yes, so anyway, you're a child now and you had to wear a star.
Yes, we had to wear a yellow star, go to school, and we were segregated in school. We were made to sit in the back row of the classroom, and there were fights every day. And when I was 12...
Fights among the kids.
Yes. Yeah. The Jewish kids, we were less than 10% of the student body. And our teachers who came from Hungary, they were very anti-Semitic, and we were mistreated by these teachers. And being a child of 12, so you can understand how when you're marked out in a group of students, and it was not a pleasant way of going to school, and when I was 12 and a half, we were thrown out of school. And my mother sent me away to the capital city of our province, and I became an apprentice in a shop. And my working life started at 12 and a half.
And you were a brilliant young student. You didn't want to work, you wanted to go to school.
Well, I did want to go to school, but we had no say in this matter because the powers that be, they decided for us. And being a minority, you didn't have any power to resist all these different laws that were
So
coming.
then what happened?
So life went on in Hungary till 1944. We Jews were still in our home, while by that time most of European Jewry were, as the Nazis were occupying each and every country, and with the help of their collaborators in every country, many of these countries that were occupied willingly collaborated in picking up the Jewish people or handing over a list of Jewish citizens in those particular countries. And Jews were gathered and loaded into cattle cars and shipped off to the death camps in occupied Poland. And my maternal family was shipped off from Slovakia in 1941. And the head of the state was a Dr. Tiso, who was a Roman Catholic priest. And he went to Berlin to see Hitler, and he asked him if he needs any young Jewish people for the factories. And Hitler told him that, yes, we can use young people, but you have to pay 500 marks for each and every one of them, because we have to train them first. And so Dr. Tiso said, that's not a problem. And he came back to Slovakia and confiscated money from the Jewish people. And so, in fact, they paid their own exit from Slovakia to Germany. And this was the system in many of these countries. You know, when you really think about it, this was an economic grab for all these countries. Even though they were occupied, they moved into our homes. And the SS units, they gathered art or what have you, because the SS were in charge of all the Jews in occupied Europe.
They raped the country, and I mean, the Jewish people, they raped all of their possessions and their belongings and their treasures, really.
Well, they raped, burned, and plundered, as you might say,
Yeah.
And everything was hauled back to the fatherland. And then they took us bodily and to the death camps.
So, Max, what happened in 1944?
In 1944, when SS troops came to Hungary on March the 15th, Eichmann arrived in Budapest to organize the deportation of Hungarian Jews. At that time, there were 700,000 Jews in Hungary. These were the last pool of Jews left in Europe. And we were going to celebrate Passover. My father and my uncle were home from the labor battalions. And coming from a traditional Orthodox family, there's a big to-do when you are changing dishes and everything for Passover. And we had our first Seder. We were all sitting at the table, around the table, and with all these wonderful foods, and we were reciting the Haggadah, the exodus of the Israelites from slavery to freedom, not realizing just a few hours hence, we are going to be going exactly in the opposite way, from relative freedom to slavery and worse. And we retired about 12 o'clock at night, knowing that next morning we can get up at a leisure time and go to synagogue, and then we'll have the second Seder. But while we were doing this, plans were already in force. They were mobilizing all the gendarmes, and early morning, gendarmes broke into our home, and they were yelling and screaming that you have 5 minutes to pack a bundle. So my mother said, put on layers of clothing, and my father says, put your boots on, and then he went to my grandparents' quarters, and the gendarmes were yelling, if you have any money or jewelry, hand it over, because where you're going to have no need of this. And you're getting all these messages, and you don't know what to make of it. I was 15 years old, and we were hustled out of our home, and I had 3 dogs. I had an Alsatian who was my dog. He was our guard dog, and I had 2 fox terriers. And I remember that moment when we left the house, and we had a big fence with a big gate, and the gate was closed, and the dogs were inside. They were barking their heads off because they knew that something serious is going on here.
They could sense
So we were collected in the schoolhouse, and we spent the first night in the schoolroom, 2 schoolrooms for 400 Jews. From my town, there were about 400 Jews, 90 Jewish families. So I couldn't understand why I need to be here when my home is only about 25 minutes away.
Yeah.
So this was our first removal from relative freedom to a loss of freedom, where now we were ordered to stay with all our neighbors together in one room. And the next morning, we were assembled in the schoolyard, and the gendarmes marched us through the town, 400 Jews with their bundles. And this was really an exodus of Jews from my town. And the rabbi was made to walk in the front of the column with his wife, who was an invalid. She had to be carried by her two sons on a chair because didn't have any other way to take her. But I'll never forget, we walked through our neighbors with whom we have lived for generations, who were Christian people. It was like a wall of hatred on each side. And I've seen many of these neighbors who were looking out from the homes of the Jewish homes as we walked by. And when we came by our house, and the dogs realized that they must have known that we were in this column because they were barking. And so what I took away from my town at that particular time, remembering the people.
Had somebody already moved into your house by this time?
Well, I found out later that as soon as we were taken out of our home and we turned around the corner, neighbors descended on our home and they carried everything out. And eventually somebody moved in. So this is the way we left my home, and we wound up in a brickyard in a city called Kasha, where 30,000 Jews were assembled. And life here was absolutely terrible. There was only one tap of water that was coming in, and you came face to face with a communal latrine. There was no way to wash. I don't know how my mother, I had a little sister, she was 9 months old. She couldn't breastfeed her because she didn't have enough food to eat. So these were the things that you had to cope with. But what the Nazis used was a massive apparatus of deception. Every day, a SS officer came and he told us that you're going to be resettled in the East. Families will be together and you will be working on farms. And he repeated the same lie day after day. And this was the Nazi brainwashing. And when people are drowning, they would grasp for any straws. Yeah. And we couldn't wait to get to this wonderful place he was telling us about. So.
And instead you went to Auschwitz.
And instead the transports were leaving, and we were loaded into these cattle cars, some 100 of us, and then handed over to an SS unit, and they came and they closed the doors and bolted it down. And then we knew we were in a box. There was no way out. And I was in this cattle car for 3 days and nights.
No water?
Initially there was a pail of water and another pail for sanitary purposes, but that was gone within seconds. Whoever was near a pail of water drank the water, because I was stuck in a corner and I couldn't get from that corner anywhere. You were like in a can of sardines. And so imagine that you cannot go to a washroom for 3 days, and you are stuck to the floor, your feet are glued to the floor, and all the emotions, old people, young babies. I mean, you can write a book of what it's like to go through this experience. And we arrived.
This is something like what it looked like when you arrived, is it?
When we arrived, the train came to a stop. It was pitch black. And I thought that we arrived at our final destination, that nothing could be worse than what I've just experienced. Mm-hmm. And our door was open, and a light flooded in, and I could see a platform with SS soldiers all around and dogs. And there was a terrible smell in the air, and we were hustled out from these wagons. And we were separated, men and women were separated. And a selection began, and this selection was done by doctors. And many times there was a Dr. Mengele who was called the Angel of Death.
Yeah.
And this is what a transport looked like. People are confused because you don't know what's happening. And here you can see that these are women and children who are going to be marched into the gas chambers. Mm-hmm. They call these people lives not worth living. And by the way, these selections happened when they were selecting people for slave labor, depended on how many workers they needed in these factories all around Auschwitz. Mm-hmm. If they did not have demand for workers, then the entire transport was sent into the gas chamber. So they were very astute people. There was no demand. They didn't need these people because they were not feeding anybody unless you worked for it, you see.
And we showed this picture before, but this is again, there's selection. And you mentioned that their crematoria, the very place where
right there in the back, that's one of the crematoria. There were 4 of these huge installations in strategic position on both sides of the platform. And when Hungarian Jews were funneled in here in 1944, 450,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered in a span of 3 months. So this was a slaughterhouse operated on an industrial scale.
And
that's what this place was.
You brought a picture. Well, this is the overview of Auschwitz. This is how organized it was.
This is Birkenau.
Or Birkenau.
And you can see where the train is standing on the platform. This was taken by American bombers overhead. And you can see a transport being taken to this first gas chamber. 1, 2, 3, 4, and these are pits where they were burning Hungarian Jews. And there's hundreds of barracks. There are different camps. Women's camps, camps for Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsy camp, and there was a camp here for Terezin people who were totally liquidated in August of 44.
Terezin is the camp.
It was a camp in occupied Czechoslovakia,
Theresienstadt.
yeah.
And then, so this shows the actual crematoria.
This is crematorium 2, and so this is above ground, and below ground was the gas chamber, and the bodies were lifted up by a hydraulic lift to the ground floor where all the ovens were built. And this is where bodies were, teeth were yanked out, gold teeth were yanked out from bodies, and then they were put into the ovens. So there's 4 installations like that. And by the way, these 4 gas chambers and crematoria were blown apart by the Nazis sort of at the end of November 1944. They thought that they don't want to leave any evidence behind, but the bricks and everything is there today. And these are the furnaces. And there is a letter that I have, an engineer who was working on how to get bigger production to join the furnaces together. They call them 3-muffle and 8-muffle furnaces. There was a fan blowing air through so that they can consume the bodies faster. And he wrote a letter to his company asking for a bonus because he's built these bigger...
I found that letter. Here it is.
Yeah. Well, here's a letter by this engineer to his company, Ludwig and Ernest Wolfgang Topf. And this is dated Erfurt, the 6th December 1941. Dear Monsieur Topf, as you know, I designed both the 3-muffle and 8-muffle cremation furnaces, and this using mainly my free time at home. These furnace constructions pioneer the way for the future, and I venture to hope that you will grant me a bonus for the work involved. Heil Hitler, Kurt Prüfer. How proud a man who went to university would put this down on paper, furnaces that pioneered the way for the future. Had he come up with a new way to heal people, I could understand, but to say something like this is absolutely unbelievable.
Unbelievable. So now you ended up, you were a young lad, and you got, tell us about what happened. You went into the camp and you were under a work party, because I guess they thought that you were worth something, you were young and you could work.
Well, the selection on the platform, I was lucky that my father and my uncle...
Yes, you mentioned that.
And myself, we were selected for slave labor.
Yeah.
And we were given tattooed numbers and striped outfits. And we were marched from Birkenau to Auschwitz I, about 3 kilometers down the road. And we were put into a work unit. And I can tell you that my father and uncle were my guardian angels. Had they not been with me, I would not have survived the first week in this place. It was, how do you get acclimatized to living in such a hellhole, where there are people who are hardcore, who are there for maybe a year or perhaps a year and a half. People would kill for a crumb of bread. And there were 40 languages or so spoken here.
Now, I'm sorry I'm jumping around, but when you were in that car, you were with your family, your mother and your brothers and your father and your uncle. Okay, so then you got to this camp and you were split. Well,
upon arrival, when on this platform, that's where the selection happened. And this was done by doctors who swear an oath that the first Hippocratic oath they have to swear is that you will do no harm. And they broke this oath and they selected people. So my family My mother, my two younger brothers, my little sister, my grandparents, and my aunt. They were selected out. They were sent to the left. And they told us that we will meet up with them the next day. So you can see the deception, how they worked it on this platform to the last second until they were packed into the gas chambers and the doors were locked. So, and we thought that we were going to meet up with them the second day. I mean, there were so many things going on. After 3 days, you are standing in one place. Now there's all this buzz with SS soldiers, dogs, and all this selection going on. And then you're marched off to a building where you have to get undressed, and the only thing you can keep were your boots. And our hair is cut, and then we're marched through a shower and put into a barrack with triple-tier bunks. And women who were selected, they were processed the same way in another barrack, and they were taken to the women's camp. Their hair was shaved, and the next morning we were given tattooed numbers and uniforms, and I became a slave laborer. And we were taken to Auschwitz I, as I told you before.
Yes.
And so life here...
And this piece of paper here is actually a document that shows how organized the Nazis were.
Well, you see, they say that the pen is mightier than the sword, and they wrote everything down. And this is in the archives in Auschwitz today, which is under the Polish government, and somebody discovered this for me. And this is a document was written 9/7/1944, and it's addressed to the Hygiene Bacterium Department of the Waffen-SS, Auschwitz. And these are numbers and names. These are people that were chosen for medical experiments from Barrack 5A, and my father and uncle are on this list.
Here.
A9891, these are Hungarian transports marked with an A. And my number is A9892, and my uncle is A9893. So this is their last will and testament. And this is also their death warrant. There's nowhere else that there is any marker to say that these two men were here on this earth. So many things have been written down there, millions of other documents.
You had only a moment to say goodbye to them.
I had only seconds to say goodbye the next day, after I came back from work, and I was looking for them in this quarantine area where they were put. And my father blessed me, as it was a usual thing that we were always blessed Friday night when we came home from the synagogue. And I'm sure that this was the last thing that he could do on this earth to try to keep me going. And that was separation, that was goodbye. And I realized that this is the end of my family, and I'm here all alone in this terrible place. And I was in Auschwitz till 1945 of January, when the death marches started. And we were walked for 3 days and nights nonstop without any food. We were grabbing snowflakes and trying to get a handful of snow. And those that couldn't walk, they fell out of the column, and they were dispatched with a bullet in their heads. So thousands were killed in this manner, and then they put us into open flat cars.
But wait, before you go to that, Max, can you tell us about the kind of work that they absconded you, they hit you on the head, you had to go to the hospital. Tell our viewers what happened to you.
Well, I was working in a field where we had to clear this area, so they cut some trees down, they dynamited the roots, and we had to remove these roots. And I was hiding in some bushes. Imagine that we are working in a large area in a field, and there's SS units with dogs. They put a cordon around us so that there's no way that you can escape. But there are always the commandant who used to walk around and check things, and he happened to see me under these shrubs. So he hit me on my head, and I started to bleed, and they threw me in a ditch, and I was in shock, and I couldn't stand up because I lost so much blood. And at the end of the day, and that afternoon, the commandant told me, he gave me this sign, and this sign meant that you're going up in the chimney. So I knew that this was my fate. At the end of the day, that's where I'm going to wind up. But they dragged me back to Auschwitz, Auschwitz I, and they dropped me off in front of the hospital, and I was operated on. There was an operating room in Auschwitz I, for the simple reason that the International Red Cross came through there. and they wanted to show them that this is a labor camp with an operating room and people are being taken care of.
This is a picture of the operating room here.
This is a picture of the operating room. So I was in the hospital there for about 3 days, and the system here was that if you were not out Friday morning, then the entire hospital was loaded up. All the people that were still there, they were put into trucks and taken to Birkenau to the gas chambers. And when I was loaded up on a stretcher, this doctor, whose name was Dr. Ozheshko, he saw me, and he took me off the stretcher and he took me into the operating room. He gave me a white coat, and I became the cleaner. And I did the cleaning, I did cleaning the instruments, floors and walls, and I was sterilizing instruments, and I was even an anesthetician after a while. I put a mask on the patient's nose, and I was just holding a bottle of ether and just drops and drops until they were ready to be operated on.
Now, in a way, this Polish doctor saved your life.
Yes, I was there about 5.5 months, and this definitely saved my life because I didn't have to work under harsh conditions outside, although I worked from 7 to 12 o'clock every day because I knew my life would hang in...
7 in the morning till 12 at night.
I mean, I had to clean this place, the place after a day of operations. I mean, the walls and the floors were, you know, you can imagine blood spurting, you know, when certain veins are cut. And I had to polish the floors every morning. I had to take the sheets and the gowns to the laundry to be washed and pick them up the next morning and roll them up and sterilize them. So I was busy, but I was a very good cleaner, and I knew, and I was, the 2 years before when I was an apprentice, I learned certain skills. So it came in very handy when I was in this hospital. And knowing that your life is in the balance, so that was a very good incentive. So I was there till January 45 when the transports, when we were taken on the death march. And
what was the purpose of that? Why did they take you out of this camp?
Well, the Soviet army was some 10 kilometers away. In fact, you can see on this picture, here is the line of the Soviet army, and you can see how close they are to Auschwitz over here.
Okay.
This is the line of the Allies.
Yeah.
I mean, it was total, it's unreal why they would want to move us, but somebody had a theory that there were tens of thousands of us here, and there were many SS units that were employed doing this, moving us all through the highways and byways all over to Austria and Germany, simply because they said that this is their business, you know. They would rather do this than go to fight the Soviet army on the east, you know.
Yes.
So this is some theory that here are people who are half dead, perhaps, and this is the job that they are doing. So I wound up, after some 12 days, going through in a flat car. We were loaded approximately over here around Breslau, through southern Poland, Dresden. We swung south to Pilsen, and I wound up in Mauthausen in Austria. I was there for 5 days, and I was walked to Melk, and I spent about 5 weeks, perhaps. We were drilling shafts into the mountain where they were building aircraft parts. And by this time, every day they were bombing.
This is in Austria now.
In Austria.
Yeah.
Allies were bombing Vienna and all these factory complexes here. And then at the end of April, they put us in barges on the Danube, and one tugboat was pulling several barges on cables. And we went to Linz, and we disembarked in Linz. And we walked 3 days to Ebensee over here. I arrived there at the beginning of April of 1945. And this was the last camp that I was in. And all these people, as you can see from these different arrows, whoever managed to come to Ebensee, we were really at the end of our strength because we were totally skeletons. And
you had, tell us the kind of food that they gave you in Auschwitz.
In Auschwitz, our diet was about 200 calories a day. It was a liquid diet. It was a cup of tea in the morning, and on this we worked till noon when we received a bowl of soup, which was mostly water. And on this we worked till night when we came back to camp. It was a slice of bread, a a cup of coffee and a tiny square of margarine. And this was your diet day in and day out. And this was the diet and the menu in all the camps pretty well.
But you said it was ersatz coffee. It wasn't really
no, it
coffee.
was not the real thing. No,
Yeah.
it was
Fake
made from
coffee.
some chicory or what have you.
Yeah.
It was, but you know, after a while you acquire a taste for these things. And you know that every little bit of soup, even though it's water, you know that it's giving you life. And I remember as a child I hated tomato soup with rice for some reason. And when you're in this camp when hunger is so terrible, there's a rolling hunger in your belly, all you're doing is you're dreaming about food. And I kept dreaming about this tomato soup, how wonderful it would be. But, you know, hunger here was very, very significant. It was, people would kill for a crumb of bread here. That's how serious it was. People would go crazy for lack of food. And
so in Ebelsee, what happened now?
in Ebensee, last month of the war, and there's typhus rampant. We are not doing any more work. We are being housed in these triple-tier bunks. They shut the water off, and there is no more rations.
So you're all sick.
We're all sick, and there is no doctors, there's no medication, of course, and we're just dying by the droves, and the bodies are thrown out into the square, in the Appellplatz. And end of April, I remember hearing airplanes overhead and noises of war. And I thought, what's going on here? And somebody shuffled into the barrack, and he said that
because they didn't have strength to lift their feet.
They couldn't lift their feet off the ground. I mean, these were walking sticks and bones, you see, skin and bones. And he said that the guard is no longer in the tower. And I thought this is probably a very important happening. And I scraped myself out of my bunk, and on my stomach I came to this big square, and I looked at the tower, and there was no SS soldier there. And I thought, this is a very important event, because I knew that the end was coming for them, but I also realized that they'll probably kill us all before they leave. And yet they were gone, because I wasn't aware that they were looking at the road, at the hill. There were some big tanks coming up, and I know from these tankers, these soldiers that were sitting on the tank, that they saw SS soldiers taking their uniform off, and they had civilian clothing underneath. So this was Liberation Day, May the 6th, 1945. And the tank was coming through the gate. They had a white star on it.
It knocked the gate down.
It knocked the gate down because it was an enclosure. And there were black soldiers sitting on the turret. You know, I'll never forget the eyes of these soldiers. They were like saucers, because what they saw here, they didn't see under any battlefield conditions. This was a crack tank unit that operated under General Patton. They came through the Battle of the Bulge. And it was called...
What did they see when they came into that square?
Well, there were mountains of bodies, and the stench was absolutely unbearable, which we didn't smell it anymore because we were living with it.
Yeah.
But, I mean, this is what they saw. And I know this from the battalion commander, because a friend of mine, she made a movie of this unit. It's called Come Out Fighting the 761st. This Fern Levitt, who did this documentary, she heard my story, and she was determined to find some soldiers from this unit. And she went to Texas. This is where they were training. And she found the battalion commander, Johnny Stevens, who lived in New Jersey area. And he came to Toronto for the screening of this documentary. And here I met this black officer who came to liberate me, who had his own issues with segregation. And here was a black soldier liberating me, who was a Jewish kid who went by train from Hungary to Poland and all around Austria. So that was a monumental moment in my life to see this Johnny Stevens. So, and he died last year. He was 86 years old. And so Liberation Day was a very significant moment in my life.
Now, when the war came to an end, now this is the end of the war, you were taken somewhere to be looked after. Where did they take you?
Well,
You were sick. You couldn't move.
we were liberated. We couldn't retain food. So that was a big problem.
You were starving, but you couldn't eat.
We were starving, but we couldn't eat. It was ironic that we were dying from lack of food, and now when there was food, we couldn't. It was killing us. And so they put us on crackers and powdered milk, but it helped us somewhat. But 2 months later, they were clearing the camp out, and so they asked who's from Czechoslovakia. We were loaded onto trucks and we were taken back to Czechoslovakia.
Before you go there, though, could you tell what those soldiers did? They brought the local people from Austria into the camp.
Yes, when the tank unit came in, they were still in a war mode because they capitulated 2 days later. So another unit came called the 80th U.S. Infantry Division. They were administering the camp. So here they had a camp on their hands with thousands of dead bodies, and every barrack was full of people with typhus. So they took the people out, they DDT'd us, they tried to wash us, they put us into tents with army cots, and they brought in flamethrowers and they burned the whole camp to the ground. And they brought in bulldozers and they were digging trenches for all these thousands of bodies. There was no way to identify individual people here, you see. So they were buried en masse, and they brought in the people from Eisen, and they were in their best finery, men with hats and women with hats, and they all had a handkerchief in their face because the smell was unbelievable here.
But that smell must have wafted down into their village.
Well, of course, they must have seen or smelled the smoke before, but people said, you know, we just didn't know. It is amazing how they didn't know. They had probably their husbands who were doing part of this nasty work. But I remember so vividly how they had to pick up these bodies. They looked like rag dolls, and pick them up and dump them into these trenches. So Americans made them come up and see this. And so and it was all filmed by American Army. It was done in many different camps. In fact, Eisenhower ordered all the photographers to record everything in detail, that people eventually, you know, later on will not be able to say that, you know, this was. But if deniers will do anything, they will say that this was only a facade made by Hollywood, you see.
Yeah.
So this was.
How does that make you feel?
Well, it's a terrible thing to say. It's a very hurtful feeling. It's like saying that the world is not round, it's flat. But it's documented, and all we can call their attention, all the documents that are available today in Germany, because the killers wrote everything down.
Yeah, like your
They
document.
put it down on paper, and they were their own archivists, you see. And
this is your document?
that's my document. I was booked in to Auschwitz May the 8th, 1944, and booked into Mauthausen January the 25th, 1945. It says Hungarian Jew, and here are my vital statistics: height and build. It says slim. You imagine how slim I was by then. Hair, eyes, mouth, and ears, and everything. It says normal. And you know, the Nazis had this idea that the Jews you can tell a Jew from 2 miles away, and yet they put down that I looked normal. Except that I was a skeleton, you see. And so this was discovered in Mauthausen.
Now, you went to get healed from typhus and lice and being totally malnourished. Where did you go?
2 months later, they took us back to Czechoslovakia, and I was determined to get back to my home. And I had to walk. I took rides with farmers on their horse and buggy, and it took me weeks to get back home. And the last few kilometers, I could see my home from this hill, coming down the hill, and I could see the house, and I was just so hopeful that by some miracle somebody would be there.
Your mother or your sister?
To take care of me, but I knew that this is only a fantasy, you know, that it cannot be. But I always hope that wouldn't be a miracle.
And you saw something.
I saw clothes drying on a line. This was a familiar sight. You know, that's what we did, because in those days we didn't have wash machines. Everything was drying outside. So I walked into my mother's kitchen, and there was a neighbor who was sitting there, and I told her who I was. I looked kind of strange because I was not the same person that I was a year before, because I thought that I was away for 1,000,000 years. I'd gone to hell and back. And she was not very happy to see me. And when I asked her for a glass of water, she didn't want to give me a glass of water. So I knew that this is an entirely new ball game.
Unbelievable.
And I walked from my house to the center of town, where just a year before they walked us from the center of town to the railway station. And I didn't see anybody on the street. I could see curtains moving in the windows. And I heard stories after, you know. And they saw us coming, but they said, well, some people said, who said that Hitler killed all the Jews? Look, there's another one coming. And I met two of my friends who came back about a month before, and we realized that we're not welcome and we're not safe here. So this was my homecoming. In my town, out of 400 Jews, less than 20 of us returned. There was only one partial family, a mother, Mrs. Rosenberg, with her 2 daughters, and they came to Israel. She's died quite a while ago, and her 2 daughters live, I'm not sure exactly where, I think around Tel Aviv somewhere. And the rest of us were single kids. So this was the price that my town paid. My extended family of 65 to 70 people, there are only 3 of us that survived.
The miracle is that you aren't a bitter person. I mean, here you come back to your own town and the people are still anti-Semitic. And then you go on to a DP camp. Tell us about that, and then trying to get into Canada. What happened then?
Well, how do you pick up the pieces when you come back and in 1 year you lost your entire extended family? There's no uncles, aunts, cousins. And it's like there's a tremendous void in your life. You don't know who to go to. So I found out about an orphanage that was being formed in a place called Marienbad outside Prague. So I wound up there. It was a yeshiva, a school of Jewish learning. I was learning to be a dental technician. There were about 35 of us, and I was there for 3 years. And it took me about 3 years to become a normal person, physically and mentally.
Yeah.
And then in 1948, Czechoslovakia, all these terrible things happened to Czechoslovakia. The communists made a putsch, which means that they arrested President Beneš and the chiefs of staffs and the heads of the Democratic Party, and the communist era began. And we kids, we knew that we've lived under fascism, Nazism, and now communism. We knew this is no good. So we picked ourselves up and we're running across the borders to occupied the American zone in Austria. And I wound up in a DP camp near Linz called Abelsberg. And this was only a station, a momentary station, only for a few months. Mm-hmm. And we went to the Canadian consulate in Salzburg because we had some permits in Prague. A rabbi from Toronto sent us permits to come to Toronto as students. So we went to see the Canadian ambassador, and he said, that's okay, you know, well, they'll call the permits to Salzburg, but we have to go through medical checks, x-rays, and so on. And we were all rejected, and we couldn't figure out why.
Yeah, why?
Well, the Canadian government had a policy, even in 1949, that Jews and blacks were the bottom on the list. Their preferred immigrants were people from the Baltic states. And this was Canada's policy pre-World War II, and many other countries. I mean, even the United States, they had no room for Jews, you see.
And here, I'm a Canadian, I'm ashamed of that, because Canada could have benefited enormously by the Jews coming, instead of going to the Holocaust, they could have come to Canada and built the country and helped.
Yes.
They were scientists, they were academics, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they were farmers, they were skilled people.
Exactly.
And we missed it. Canada threw it away, and now...
That was it's written in a book called None is Too Many.
Yes.
The agent of Canadian Pacific Steamship Lines in Rotterdam who these people approached, and he sent messages to Canada that we have people with such tremendous knowledge, farmers who've got money to start new things, and enterprises and doctors and so on. But they were not allowed to come.
And now still 10 years later, they're doing the same thing?
Well,
what did you feel?
Well, I felt very bad. I was desperate because I didn't know where I'm going to go. The camp was being emptied. Kids were going to all different places. And I was determined that I need to go to Canada because that's where we had our permits. If you didn't have a permit, an invitation to come, there was nowhere you could go.
Yeah.
So finally, October, we went to the embassy and we got our stamp from the Canadian consul. And that was a happy moment. And the next day we were put on a train, sent to Bremen, put on a ship called the Samaria, and we arrived in Quebec City. October the 29th, I believe it was, when I landed in Quebec City. And I kissed the ground and I knew that I was home. And left Europe with all those terrible memories behind. And I was put on a train and sent to Toronto, and my life unfolded in Toronto.
But the problem is your memories couldn't really be left behind.
Well, you will never forget what happened to you, but you know, we survivors came to this new world and we were so determined to go ahead. We never talked about this. We needed to start a new life and careers. This was our way of doing things. You would have thought that we would have picked up guns and killed people, but that's not what we did. We just wanted to get away from there, because if you carry this hatred in your chest, it eventually kills you. So we left this behind us. We will never forget it. But we were determined to start a new life. And all these survivors that came to Canada and other countries, they made a large difference in these cities and countries. And for this, we are most grateful to Canada that they allowed us at that stage to allowed us to come and start a new life.
You became a successful businessman, but also you met your wife. How did that happen?
Well, the first job that I was sent to, the manager, this lady, she wanted to know where I come from. In fact, my Hungarian name was Tibor. And she said, "What kind of name is Tibor? It's strange." She asked me, "What is your Hebrew name?" I said, "Mordechai." So she said, "We'll call you Max." So it's sort of, Max and Mordecai sort of fit together. So she invited me to her home, and I met my future wife. She was 15 and I was 20. And 2 years later we were married. And we had a family. We had twin boys and we have 2 granddaughters. We're really a nuclear family. But that's the way it is. And
now, you've been honored by the March of the Living, and this is a beautiful presentation to Max Eisen. I hope we can get this on camera here. And it's the annual March of the Living of young people that go back to Auschwitz and to Birkenau and to these places. And it says here, in honor, Max Eisen, presented to Max Eisen, in honor of your participation in the March of the Living, and for sharing your courageous story of survival, and I can say amen to that, thereby helping educate the next generation concerning the lessons of the Shoah. And it's signed by the national chairman of the March of the Living in Canada. 2 people. What do you do now? How do you educate the next generation?
Well, my generation has a duty to educate the second generation and the third generation, because both second and third generation go on this March of the Living.
Oh, okay.
And I look at it as a relay race, that we carry the baton and the next group has to take it over, and then the next group. And we hope that they will learn. They need to see what happened in Europe. And the reason, and that's why we go to Poland first, and then we come to Israel. And and by the way, this year there were some 10,000 students, Jewish kids, high school students from all over the world, Australia and you name it, Siberia, and I don't know, there were so many.
Canada also.
Canada,
Yeah.
and on the day of Yom HaShoah, we have a March of the Living. It's versus what we had, the Death March. And we want to be there and have a memorial service. This is where my parents were murdered.
Do you say Kaddish for them?
We say Kaddish.
Good.
Yeah, there's a memorial
Yes.
service, and
Yeah.
I was on the podium and said Kaddish this year with two other people from New York. And I sat beside the chief of staff, Gabi Ashkenazi, and Rabbi Lau was in the next chair. And so we go back, and it is a very difficult trip because we go to many different camps. Majdanek is another horror camp, and everything is there as it was because they didn't have a chance to destroy it. So, and there are many non-Jewish groups that are coming too, and this is a good thing for people to learn, you know, how civilized societies are capable of doing these kind of horrible things.
Now, Max, something very distressing happened to you in the hotel where you're staying. Do you feel at liberty to share a little bit about that, or?
Well, just a little bit. I think it was on Yom HaZikaron when we were in the lunchroom. There were only 3 of us left in the lunchroom. And when
Yom HaZikaron for our viewers means remembrance
Day of Remembrance
Day.
for Israeli soldiers who fell in battles.
And just before that is Yom HaShoah, which is the Remembrance Day of the Holocaust victims.
Yes. And there are 22,000 soldiers fell in the 60 years, guardians of this little state. And while the siren was going on, there were some waiters, young men, who were very disrespectful, and we were totally in shock, you know. And so we discussed it after the siren stopped among us, what we should do about that. So this other person contacted the manager, and then I contacted him after. I didn't know that my friend did this because I was on a tour in the meantime, but I was thinking about it all day, that I should be doing something that, and so my friend contacted him, and he said, look, I want you to come down and we'll line them all up and we'll fire them. And so my friend said, look, I don't want to point anybody out. That is not a way that we want to do this. I would like to talk to them. So, and that's what he did. And he explained to them how disrespectful it is to disrespect soldiers who died, that we wouldn't do this to anybody, you know. If you live in this country, you respect what's happening here. And I told my friend, I wonder what would have happened if we were in Ramallah and we would have done this on a memorial for their soldiers. So that's what happened. So hopefully the manager
do you think
will do the right thing.
Did it have any impact on those young men?
Well, I don't know. I didn't see the young men, but I know the manager was talking to me, and he felt very bad about it, and he said, I promise you that this will never happen again. So
so we have a lot of work to do.
There's a lot of work to be done, yes, definitely.
Well, Max, I want to say on behalf of our viewers, thank you so much for being our guest here today. And I just felt that we should read this poem in closing. This is a very moving poem that sort of says it all, doesn't it? Would you like to read it? Maybe you should read it.
This poem was written by Charlotte Delbo, a French author who survived in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I just want to say something before I read this. These women, young girls and women in their 30s who were slave laborers, their life was even worse than the men's, simply because they were women.
Right.
Their hair was cut, they had one rag, no underwear. So imagine what it does to your psyche, you know, and how determined they were to go on, simply because they realized that it's survival of the species. And you know, women formed support groups, and Birkenau was a terrible place. Women did not get any preferential treatment. They did work. They were strapped into a big steel roller. They were rolling stones on the road. This is the kind of work they were doing. And this was one of these women who survived. And it goes like this. Oh, you who know, did you know that hunger makes the eyes sparkle, that thirst dims them? Oh, you who know, did you know that you can see your mother dead and not shed a tear? Oh, you who know, did you know that in the morning you wish for death, and in the evening you fear it? Oh, you who know, did you know that a day is longer than a year, a minute longer than a lifetime? Oh, you who know, did you know that legs are more vulnerable than eyes, nerves harder than bones, the heart firmer than steel? Oh, you who know, did you know that suffering is limitless, that horror cannot be circumscribed? Did you know this, you who know? Charlotte Dalbo.
Well, Max, I don't know how to say thank you, but I do on behalf of my generation, my children's generation. Thank you so much for your life.
Thank you.
Thank you. Come
Thanks
back
very
again.
much. I will.
Ladies and gentlemen, please pray for the Holocaust survivors in Israel, more than 150,000 of them, and Holocaust survivors all over the world. They're in their waning years and they need your prayers. Thank you for being with us today, and till next time, shalom from Jerusalem.